New Year's Day of 2023. It was at this very day that I have asked myself this one oddly specific question. Wouldn't it be cool to play a dungeon crawler roguelite game in which you're also able to move the floor in a similar way like you move the tiles in one of those analog sliding puzzle games for children? I asked myself this question at a point of time at which I just released my last video. A video about another game called Bouncy on which I was working on for quite some time. From a regular upload schedule point of view, it's been 6 months. It would have been smart to continue working on this game or one of the many other prototypes I made over the last years. But this one question didn't want to leave my head, and I was afraid there was only one solution, only one way to continue, trying to answer it. And the only answer that came to my mind was, maybe? Now, this answer wasn't satisfying. I figured that the only way to really answer this question was to do something that would take a lot of time.
6 months.
I had to start developing another new video game from scratch. So I guess in this video I will show you how this one silly question first turned into this, then into this, and finally into this. Feel free to join me on a little game development journey. Maybe at the end of this video we will be able to figure out an answer together. Now, of course, when I asked myself this question, I had a bit more of an idea on my mind than just remixing those two random concepts of entertainment. Let me pitch you the general idea. We start with a generic roguelite dungeon crawler game mechanic. The player will take control of one character, which they use to move around, fight with different types of enemies, and then move on to the next level of the dungeon after the requirements for proceeding are met. Very by the books. Now, where the sliding puzzle game idea comes into play is the following. Imagine the floor is divided into smaller rectangular pieces or tiles. Now you remove one of these tiles and then you could start moving them around. Exactly like in those analog picture puzzles. Let's then add some randomly distributed walls to the tiles and some other mechanics specifically tailored to this mechanic, and then in theory, so I thought, this could lead to some deeper tactical gameplay and interesting decisions made by the player. For now, let's stop the brainstorming and start the actual work. Making the game. Before I started to write any code, I wanted to draw a quick mock-up of how the game could potentially look like. For an art style, I decided to go for a quite minimalistic pixel art approach, because that's something I can pump out comparatively fast and also enjoy a lot for this type of game. I wasn't sure about actual tile and reference resolutions, which would work in my favor, so I decided to just eyeball it and go with a 32 by 32 pixel resolution for the tiles. I then also drew some ideas for a character, items, and also a very basic skeleton enemy. For the background, I had the idea to later write some kind of trippy and or atmospheric animated shaders like you can find a lot on Shader Toy. So for the purpose of the mockup, I just screenshotted this kaleidoscope shader and used it as a reference background for the moment. Now that I had a first mockup of a potential look of the game done, it was finally time to start the implementation process. As usual, I worked with Unity for this project, and so I created a new project and got started. So I added my placeholder background and then added a testing tile to the scene to test out how it looks in the engine. So what I did set up right away was a pixel perfect camera in combination with an upscale rendering texture. Now whatever I do to the 2D sprites in the scene, the outcome will always fit the configured reference resolution. You can see the difference quite well here when I rotate the tile. The first actual coding session took place when it was time to implement the tile and grid system. Fortunately, thanks to another project of mine called Exocolony, I'm quite used to implementing 2D grid and tile systems. The major difference is that in this game, the tiles will actually move around, and of course the procedural generation of each floor is also another new aspect. Here you can see the dynamic floor generation in action. After that was done, I also added these arrows, which are there to display every currently possible direction to move a tile. Now it was time for the fun part, making those tiles move. Regarding player input, I had the idea that it would make sense to use the controller face buttons to move the tiles, while the left analog stick and the shoulder buttons are still available for player controls. Let's have a look at the first tiles actually moving around. Beautiful. Of course, the movement is super stiff and slow at the moment, but that's a polishing task for later time. My implementation worked, and that was all I cared for at this moment. One thing I wanted to also tackle while I was working on those tiles was the randomized wall generation. I made it so that I configure a wall density value, which would then define how many walls are activated on each floor. Of course, every tile had to leave at least one wall open for the player to traverse, and then I also had to make sure that there are also tiles which allow for a change of player direction. Otherwise, there could be a scenario where it wouldn't be possible to reach a target tile. So overall, a couple of constraints I had to take into account while developing this feature. Now, the tiles are moving, but we still need a player character. So it's time to program a very simple first version of a player character controller. Et voila! Indeed very simple, but now we can move the player mockup sprite around. That's what I call progress. Do you remember when I talked about the stiff tile movement and that I wanted to polish that at a later time?
But that's a polishing task for later time.
I did that. Instead of those tiles moving at a linear speed, I used the twinning library to utilize easing functions, which are allowing for a much more natural and satisfying movement. Of course, there is still a lot of tile movement polish potential, but again, that's for later. Let's have a look at the player character moving around on this one tile again. As you can see, there's not a great amount of space for the character to maneuver. I mentioned that I just eyeballed the current tile size, and that this might change later down the development. Now actually, it's already bound to change, because of the spacing issue I just described, and also because with the current tile size I felt a bit limited in regards to expressing a certain style and environment in those sprites. So here I am in A-Sprite again, pixeling some new tiles. I went for a different, more defined style on the walls and floor and resized the tiles to 48 by 48 pixels. Let's have a look at how these new sprites and the new style look in action. Yeah, already much better than before, in my opinion. You can also see that there's now a lot more space for a player character to move around. And while that character is somewhat cute, I also had the urge to iterate on this little fella. Here you can see my then new idea for a bit more detailed character sprite, which would also allow for more readable animations. While I wanted the overall vibe of the game to be a bit more darker and gritty, I still wanted there to be some cuteness in it, so I approached the character animations like I usually do when it comes to pixel art, in a cute, bouncy way. And here we go. Check out this cute little buddy, looking like they're up to some silly dungeon crawler business. Around this time, I also stumbled across a certain issue. As you can see here, it is a bit difficult to figure out which tile a wall belongs to. Now, this is very important information for players because without it, it's difficult to know how to correctly move the tiles to achieve a certain goal. So, that's a problem. One possible solution I came up with was to color the tiles and walls in a checkerboard style. Now it is a bit easier to understand which wall belongs to which tile, but it also interferes a bit with the general visual aesthetic. So I don't think it's a perfect solution, and you'll see me activating and deactivating this feature over the rest of the video. In the current build of the game, it's an option that players can activate and deactivate themselves, but I'm still looking for a better solution. If you have any ideas, please feel free to let me know in the comment section. So, while our little player avatar is able to walk around and move those puzzle tiles, there's still a lot of gameplay aspects missing, which are usually found in a roguelite dungeon crawler. Like fighting, for example. So I started to draw a first version of an animation for one of the most basic kinds of video game attacks that exists. A sword attack. Not the most elaborate animation, but it should do the trick for the moment. And a small coding session later, the super basic attack was implemented. And I then took the skeleton mockup sprite and also added it to the game as an equally super basic kind of first enemy. The player is able to hit this evil skeleton fella and it at least somewhat reacts to the hit by being shoved around the level. While having an enemy as a punching bag is kind of fun, it is even more fun when the enemy is also doing more than just standing around. Like, I don't know, attacking the player for example. So, I programmed a very simple AI to make this happen. If the enemy has a direct visual connection to our player in whatever direction, the enemy will then start moving to the player. As simple as it can get. But simplicity doesn't mean that there's no potential for some very interesting bugs. Like, Bye-bye. Maybe I should add some walls to our dungeon. Hey, do you remember the thing I said a couple of minutes ago? when I described how I thought that 32 by 32 pixels are not big enough.
And also because with the current tile size, I felt a bit limited in regards to expressing a certain style and environment in those sprites.
Yeah, so that kinda happened again, and now I made the tile 64 by 64 pixels. I don't really know what to say. I think it's better now. Feels better to me at least. So, yay. After that, I wanted to finally make the background a little bit more interesting. Like I mentioned, I wanted to try implementing some kind of shader art, and my very first approach was something kinda simple. Just a very basic swirl shader applied to a Voronoi noise texture. There we go. And when it's upscaled to match the pixel art resolution, it looks kinda cool, in my opinion. At least much better than a plain background. So, let's pause for a moment and look at what we already have implemented. At this time, I was working on the game for roughly 2 months in my free time. The tile puzzle movement is implemented and works kind of fine. Then we have our little player character walking around fighting with those skeleton thugs. Neat. I would say the most basic features are already there. And now it's time to turn this into an actual game and flesh it out a bit. And to make it a little bit more interesting and put some pressure on myself, how about a deadline? If you have seen my last video, there is an indie developer meetup in the city I live called the IndieTreff. I try to go there every time I possibly can and present what I'm currently working on to the nice people who are also there. So from this point of time on, I had about 2 more months until the next meetup was scheduled, and the game was far away from actually being a kinda complete experience that's worth being presented. So, time to put in some effort and make it worth my time. First step. While the player was able to move around on one floor, there was no way to progress to the next one. So I added a stair/exit entity, which spawns at random on one tile at the beginning of each floor. For the start, I made it so that walking on these stairs will actually be enough to finish the game, just so that I had a kinda complete game loop. If you're paying attention, you might have noticed that those tile floors look a bit different and less monotonous than before. That's because I also repainted them and then made it so that every tile will generate the floor visuals randomly based on a couple of possible smaller tiles, which will themselves tile seamlessly with each other. Exciting stuff. And while I was at it, I also painted the floor and wall art for a second different biome. After I integrated and tested those new sprites, I finally wanted to start working on floor transitions. For visual effect, I thought it might look super cool to let the tiles do a 180-degree rotation and then let them change their appearance and contents at the very moment they are invisible. To better understand what I mean, here you can see how I'm already able to let random tiles rotate in the way I described. Time to test this on an actual floor transition. In preparation for that, I programmed some meta gameplay logic and set everything up in a way that there are 5 floors which the player has to traverse through to beat the game. Let's have a look at it. Okay, so beating the game is actually super easy, but obviously that was not how I wanted it to work. Another try. So this looks better, but what's up with the skeleton? It survived the floor transition, which is not what I wanted, and it also looks kinda mushed together, probably because of some still applied rotation. Ugh. It was a kinda tiresome process to get this floor transition to work, and I stumbled on a multitude of bugs. There were times when some tiles just stopped rotating at 90 degrees, and then also my personal highlight, there are now just 2 player characters. I guess you could almost glorify this as a feature, but for the moment it meant that there was still something very wrong with my code. So like I mentioned, it took me maybe a bit more than just some time and a lot of pain to work through all the bugs, but after that it looked like it was working how I wanted it to. At least. Now that this was done, I felt that I deserved some kind of a tweet task for all the hard work. What's a tweet task? So for me at least, it's a polishing task. I love iterating on already existing mechanics or visuals, and it's always so much fun to see the individual progress in comparison. That's why I decided that this lame sword attack animation definitely needs a well-deserved second iteration. So it was a sprite time, and with the help of some great tutorials, I can't recommend miniboss pixel art tutorials enough, I was able to elevate the feel of the attack animation quite a lot. This was how the sword attack looked before, and now it looks like this. Much better. And while we are in the polishing department, what about some sweet 2D lights? Would be great, right? I thought so too. And for the start I integrated a super simple spotlight for the player character. It's not much, but it is already adding a lot of atmosphere. Another feature, which is still missing and which belongs in almost every other top-down 2D roguelite action game, is a dash. A quick and easy way to let the player evade attacks and change location. Not too complicated to implement. Just a quick magic coding session, and here we go. Doesn't our character look dashing? Oh, around this time I also added damage numbers. Another, in my opinion, essential feature that I want to have in every game that involves fighting. Wouldn't you agree that our floors look a bit empty? Besides our player, some enemies and the exit, there isn't much going on. So it was definitely time to add some decoration to the scene. And I wanted to start with the probably most obvious kind of decorative element you could imagine, a wooden barrel. And there we go. The barrel is standing around, but it's not really fun if there's no kind of interaction. So it should probably be destructible. And here we go again. Hit the barrel and the barrel is gone. Kinda boring though, so I wanted to make it more exciting by letting it spawn wooden fragments after destruction. And I made it so that they do interact with the world's physics and are therefore movable by the player. After some iterations and tweaks, I got it working in a way that felt really satisfying. I had a lot of fun just destroying a bunch of barrels and then seeing those fragments flying across the screen. To make it even more juicy, I also recycled some old particle effect animations from an older game I worked on a couple of years ago called Like Misfit. And looks pretty good in my opinion. Adding more decorative elements to the game was obviously a good idea, and I did continue doing exactly that. I will spare you all the details. Let's have a look at the more or less final result. There are now bookshelves, bones and skulls, shackles, spider webs and torches. And all of them are destructible in the same way the barrels are. To distribute those entities randomly, I set up a little spawning system with a lot of potential spawning points and constraints so that, for example, no barrel spawns inside a bookshelf, but barrels can still exist right next to each other. It's a bit tedious to configure, but for the moment it's working well enough. Now I had the feeling that the game is slowly coming together and starting to feel like an actual game, and I was kinda optimistic that I should be able to have a somewhat decent experience I can present at the upcoming developer meetup I mentioned. While I didn't have the time to go super deep into fighting mechanics, I wanted to at least have one different kind of fight mechanic besides the basic sword attack. And so I thought it would make sense to add a ranged attack, and because of the somewhat fantasy-esque setting of the current visuals, I went for a magic wand projectile attack thingy. Here you can see the magic wand I created in action, only missing the mentioned projectile, which was just a bit more difficult to implement than I would like to admit. Rotations are like super difficult and stuff. But now I want to show you something which I think is kinda cool. The projectile is now working, and it's perfect to illustrate a key problem of the moving tile system and how I think I solved it. The problem is the fact that, in theory, when a player is moving a tile, player and enemies could still also move and then maybe become stuck between two walls or glitch out or something like that. To prevent this, I made it so that every moving entity on our active floor has to make sure to stop moving whenever a tile transition is in action. And with the projectile, we have our now third moving entity in the game, which also has to follow this rule, which therefore allows for some neat trick shots. And to make aiming a bit easier and range attacks more usable in general, I also added dual stick controls. Now the player has to steer the character with the left analog stick and can aim the sword or magic wand with the right one. Besides some minor polishings, there were only 4 more major things I was able to add to the game before my upcoming deadline. The first one was a very important one. At the moment, the player can just straight on move to the stairs on every floor and avoid all the enemies. I thought it would be much cooler if they need to perform some kind of task on every floor before they can continue. For example, like finding a key or maybe defeat all the enemies before you can move on. So I drew and animated a spike fence surrounding the exit and programmed it in a way that it will only open if there are no active enemies left on the current floor. What do I mean with active enemies? That's where we are coming to the second major addition to the game, a second enemy type. After those very basic skeleton enemies, I wanted an enemy type that is more connected to the overall gameplay and tile shifting part of the game. One idea I really liked was to make some statue gargoyle-like enemies that would be stationary and inactive at start, but whenever the tile they are standing on is moved, they wake up and start attacking the player. It took me a while to find a visual style that felt fitting for the game, but the actual implementation was then kinda easy. Nice. Now that we already have 2 enemy types, it would make sense to also add a feature that allows the player to kinda level up whenever they finish a floor. A bit like in Binding of Isaac or other roguelites, whenever you make it to the exit of the current floor or level, there's an upgrade that will change your current stats. So I rushed and implemented a very basic stat system for our player character, and then again recycled a lot of older sprites from Black Misfit for the art. Now, after every floor, the player can choose between 3 different pickups that will increase different stats like attack speed, movement speed, or provide additional heart containers. Like I mentioned, it is super basic, but it's a start, and I can then iterate on this system later on. And now, to the last feature I really wanted to add to the game before I present it to other people. Even with the second enemy type, I still had the feeling that there's more potential in the tile moving mechanic, and I had one idea that felt kinda cool. The idea was that there could be part of Glyphs integrated in some of the tile floors, and whenever 2 of those parts connect in the right way, an event will trigger. For example, there could be a skeleton glyph, and whenever they connect, a new skeleton will spawn somewhere in the level. And that's also exactly the way I added this feature into the game. Unfortunately, it was the only glyph event I was able to get done before my time was over. But I somehow did it. I managed to get the game to a stage at which I felt comfortable showing it to other people. Oh, and by the way, to present the game, it of course also needed a name. So I decided to call it Cryptile for the moment. Not sure if this name will change if I should continue working on this game, but I think it's a fitting name for the moment. So I went to the mentioned IndieTreff, our local game developer meetup, and I was super curious about the feedback I'm going to receive. And what can I say? The feedback was super positive. A lot of people really dig the tile moving mechanic and had a lot of fun figuring out how to successfully maneuver through all the floors. It was a real blast to see that people enjoyed my little game, and while I was honestly very exhausted, it felt like it was the right decision to actually try answering the question everything started with 5 months ago. But then, what was the answer after all? Yes, it would actually be fun. Now, I want to invite you to answer the question for yourself. And with that I mean that you can now download the game for yourself and give it a go. I released it on my itch.io page, and you can find the link in the description. Feel free to give it a go, and feel also free to drop me your feedback, either here in the comment section or over on itch. You can also follow me on several convenient social media platforms where I post smaller updates on my current projects more regularly. I'm not sure what the next video will be about, but I can promise that this time it will not take me 6 months. I hope. Cryptile started as a short and quick prototype to prove a theory, and then evolved into a real game which took me like a lot of time. I promise that we will see each other soon, or at least sooner, in another video on this channel. Until then, have a good time and bye!